Neuromuscular disorders. Biofeedback training also is effective in voluntary control of cerebrospinal and CNS functions. We might ask, isn't that redundant? Something like saying voluntary control of voluntary behavior? Yet if we stop to think about it, we realize that some CNS functions, such as different kinds of brain rhythms, are not normally under direct voluntary control because they have no sensory representation. Learning control through brainwave training not only breaks new ground in the study of consciousness, but offers the possibility of non-drug therapy for epilepsy and other brain disorders. It is also clear that normal voluntary control over striate muscles, cerebrospinal control, can be lost, as with wry neck and tension headache, or it may be obliterated if neuromuscular connections are structurally damaged by accident or disease, or through atrophy from whatever cause. Electromyographic feedback holds promise for restoring proper function and control in such cases. For example, among the most dramatic reports in the EMG literature are Basmajian's account, to which we have already referred, of voluntary control of individual motor units through auditory and visual feedback from indwelling electrodes placed in large muscle at the base of the thumb. Such delicate control was learned that subjects could produce various rhythms of a single nerve firing gallop rhythms, drum beats, doublets, and roll effects after only 60 to 90 minutes of training. Basmajian called attention to the practical application of EMG training and rehabilitation of non-functional muscles due to paralysis or atrophy, and opened up a field of research and clinical practice. Recent evidence of interest in EMG feedback training is the establishment of a new sensory feedback unit in the ICD Medical Service, a private rehabilitation center in New York City. The director is Joseph Bredny, MD, who conducts clinical studies in sensory feedback therapy, his term for biofeedback therapy, at New York City Medical Center. The unit treats incapacitated victims of stroke, cerebral palsy, spinal cord injuries, and other CNS and neuromuscular disorders. As noted, in normal motor activity, there is internal sensory feedback from muscles to the brain, as well as control instructions from the brain to the muscles. When such sensory feedback is disrupted by accident or disease, the brain motor centers, though intact, fail to function properly or may not function at all. If the disrupted sensory information can be substituted for or augmented by external feedback, visual or auditory EMG feedback, then patients through practice can learn self-regulation and often can establish a new internal sensory loop. When this is accomplished, artificial external feedback is no longer needed. Bredny told us that he has worked with a large number of torticollis patients, though he has not reported all of the cases in the scientific literature. In one of his first reports, he tells us of the use of both auditory and visual feedback displays in training 9 patients to control this striate muscle problem. After 10 weeks of training, 7 of 9 patients learned to control muscle spasms without external feedback. Psychological gains of self-assurance, overcoming depression, and resumption of social contracts were observed in these 7 subjects. In a later report, Bredny, Corrine et al. 1974 discussed the treatment of 36 patients suffering from spinal cord injuries, hemiparesis, torticollis, and dystonia. 34 of the patients responded with varying degrees of improvement. A case reported in some detail is that of a 28-year-old electrician with a spinal cord injury that resulted in a paraplegia and marked weakness in both arms. For 3 years, he had received conventional therapy but had remained a total care patient. Bredny initiated sensory feedback therapy, he noted, with 2 specific goals: relaxation of the right spastic biceps and proration of the forearm for use of a wrist-driven splint. Within 2 weeks of the patients achieved both goals step by step. The same progress took place concurrently in the left arm without sensory feedback therapy. 2 years later, the patient will retain these functions and could feed and groom himself, type, and drive an electrical wheelchair. The researchers comment, new rehabilitation techniques could influence the quality of life of a severely disabled stroke victim, paraplegic, and cerebral palsy child. The nature of care will also improve when greater awareness of the available rehabilitation potential becomes known to government and public. In thinking about the many kinds of feedback devices for vascular control, striate muscle group, gastrointestinal control, bronchial control, heart control, brainwave control, the question naturally arises, are there certain biochemical or physiological processes yielding information that could be fed back that a person could not under any circumstances gain control over through practice? No one knows the answer to that question. Many biofeedback devices that could be built have not yet been attempted. For instance, there's no technical reason to prevent the implantation of a tiny temperature sensing device in the body to transmit by radio signal or telemetering the temperature of the surrounding tissues. That temperature indication would reflect, or be regulated by two major factors: local metabolic processes reflecting heat production and cellular activity, and local blood flow. If such a temperature sensor were implanted in a tumor, a patient might use the inflammation in conjunction with a visualization in which the blood supply to the tumor was cut off to cause the tissue to cool and the tumor to starve. Alternately, in exactly the opposite direction, the patient might visualize an increase of blood bringing leukocytes and immunological materials to the area to attack the tumor. In that case, one would expect that there would be an increase in local temperature. The Simonton's work with cancer, discussed in Chapter 8, if instrumented, could also be expected to show an increase in local temperature. Concerning tissue cooling, the following case of cancer control is surely an example. Even though the cancer was not monitored with the telemetering temperature detector, some years ago, Dr. H, a physician with whom we were acquainted, who wishes to remain anonymous, and another doctor had an opportunity to use hypnosis in the control of pain and bleeding in a terminal cancer patient. Because the cancer was on the bladder, it was possible to get information about what was happening without the use of instruments. The cancer was thought to be operable, but a preliminary operation showed that metastasis had occurred. Cancer cells had escaped from the bladder and were distributed throughout the whole body. Small cancerous cells were growing in the lungs and possibly in almost all of the body organs. The case was considered hopeless, and no operation was performed for removal of the bladder cancer. The man was sent to the cancer ward to await death. This patient proves to be an unusually good hypnotic subject and could easily go into deep amnesic trance. Whatever the doctor suggested with respect to reduction of pain immediately happened. One day it occurred to Dr. H that this particular patient would be a good one with whom to try blood flow control through hypnosis. Because of urinary complications, a catheter had been installed to relieve pressure in the bladder, and the blood and urine mixture in the transparent catheter tube gave an immediate indication of the amount of hemorrhaging in the cancerous area. While in a deep trance, the patient was told that a control center in the middle of the brain regulated all the blood vessels of the body. Could he find it? After a short time, he said, yes. When asked what it looked like, he described something like a boiler room full of pipes, or perhaps the inside of a submarine. There were valves, switches, and control levers for regulating pipes of all sizes. Dr. H told the patient that one of the pipes controlled blood flow in the cancer on the bladder, and that if he could locate that pipe and its control valve, it would be beneficial to turn it off. Soon the man reported that he had found the valve in the pipe and it was labeled, and after a few seconds he said that he had turned it off. Two doctors were very much impressed when, in a short time, there was a sharp line of demarcation between clear urine and previous mixture of urine and blood coming from the catheter tube. They decided not to discuss this event with their colleagues at that moment, and especially not the ward doctor, who seemed to be uncomfortable about the idea of using hypnosis for any purpose. Their ostensible purpose in visiting the patient each day was for the control of pain, but each day they hypnotized the patient and repeated the suggestions for blood flow controls as well as pain control. The bleeding was almost entirely stopped within a week, and the patient's appetite returned. After another week, the patient said that he wanted to go home, and because he seemed so much better, he was allowed to go home for 2 days. When he returned to the hospital, the doctors continued working with him, and now they asked for his report on the internal condition of his body. He said that the growth on the bladder, which he had described as being about the size of a grapefruit, was shrinking and now was only about the size of an orange. Since his health continuously improved, he stays at home it became longer. Eventually, he reported to the hospital only once a week. Then a time came when he was away for a month. Because of an unfortunate ending, the case did not reach the medical literature. When the patient returned after his month away, the ward doctor made a cystoscopic examination of the patient. During the examination, he accidentally ruptured the wall of the cancerous tissue remaining in the bladder. Urine escaped into the visceral cavity, and the man died of peritonitis within a few hours. Autopsy showed that the cancer on the bladder had shrunk to the size of a golf ball and that the metastasized cancers had all disappeared. It seems probable that if a temperature sensing transducer can be implanted in a tumorous mass, through visualization and feedback, the body can learn to starve out or attack and destroy the tumor. Most people whom we train in hand temperature control are encouraged to use the autogenic phrases for only a few days and then to switch to some visualization which they prefer. For example, lying on a beach with their hand in the warm sand or holding something warm in the hand, like a cup of hot tea. One trainee, a medical student, objected to these suggestions. He said that the proper visualization was to imagine that you were going outdoors in cold weather. The blood flow control circuits of the body would then automatically increase the peripheral circulation to compensate for the cold. We have all seen this effect in the rosy cheeks of children playing outdoors in the winter. I suggested we use this visualization for himself, though it may be too complex for the average person, and it worked. This indicates that the primary feature of the visualization is the end result that is desired. Mere visualization of an increase in blood flow in a tumorous area, if it did not contain the idea of attack and destroy, might not hinder the growth of the tumor. Robert Keith Wallace, in his PhD research in physiology at UCLA 1970, has demonstrated that the rate of basal metabolism can be influenced through meditation. When the meditator switched from a simple resting state to a state in which they used their meditation procedure, the basal metabolism rate dropped significantly. This is a good indication that blood sugar control might be possible. Because of the developments in blood sugar transducer design reported by Diabetes Foundation in 1975, it may be possible to implement such a biofeedback project. One transducer is a small battery-powered detector that is implanted in the abdominal wall. It detects blood sugar levels and continuously releases insulin into the body. If the insulin releasing section of the unit were replaced by a telemetering transmitter for radioing out information, the device could be used for biofeedback practice. According to the Diabetes Foundation reports, the batteries can last for a year. There are at least a dozen medical centers in the US where biofeedback researchers could conduct this kind of research. Another transducer system that already exists, but which has never been used for biofeedback so far as we know, is the kidney machine used for purifying the blood in patients whose kidneys no longer function adequately. If we were training patients with impaired, though existence kidney function, we would start with the standard autogenic training exercises and later switch to the type of organ-specific formulas that Luth and Schultz refer to. Many cases of the organ control are discussed in the literature of autogenic therapy. The addition of biofeedback would accelerate the process of gaining control. I discussed this possibility with two doctors in Boston who use kidney machines. One laughed and said that if he tried to do such a thing, he would be thrown out of the hospital. The other raised what he thought was an insurmountable problem. How can biofeedback repair a damaged kidney? The answer to that question may not be so difficult. Neil Miller and Leo DeCara, 1968, have already demonstrated that rats can control kidney functions, and anything a rat can do, we ought to be able to do better if we can only get our voluntary and involuntary nervous systems coordinated. As for how biofeedback might repair a damaged kidney, such damage is usually biochemical, and biochemicals are controlled by hormones. Each hormonal system has its own homeostatic balances, but these can be regulated in some measure by pituitary hormones. Since pituitary function is controlled by hypothalamic firings, which in turn are responsive to neural processes in the limbic system, or the emotional brain, the kidney could have been damaged originally by a chronic undesirable attitude. If a kidney can be damaged biochemically, why can't it be repaired biochemically? After all, growth and repair are biochemical processes. Our problem may be simply to learn how to restore normal, healthy homeostasis in the body. The kidneys in some patients suffer from loss of blood, perhaps a kind of Raynaud's disease in the kidney. Patients are immediately aware of Raynaud's disease in the hands, but a loss of blood in the kidney might be interpreted in several ways, depending on what biochemical and purificatory processes were disturbed. Chapter 7, Theta Training, Imagery, and Creativity. It has always seemed to me that symbolism should be restored to the structure of world education. The young are no longer invited to seek the hidden truths, dynamic and eternal, locked within the shapes of behavior of human beings. Quote, Manly P. Hall. Brainwave research. By conservative estimate, more than 1 million miles of EEG strip chart records have been generated by an army of researchers and clinicians since Hans Berger discovered in 1924 the tiny oscillating voltages on the order of 50 microvolts that emanate from the human brain. Almost all of his mileage was associated with trying to find the relationship between various brain rhythms and observable human conditions, behaviors, or diseases. For instance, data have been accumulated on the correlation of various brainwave patterns with age, basal metabolism, cataracts, dementia, epilepsy, etc. But until Joe Kamaya's research began, little information had been obtained on the consciousness and essentially no information on a person's ability to select and produce brainwave patterns at will. In 1958, Joe Kamaya was struck by the possibility that if a person were continuously informed about his own brain rhythms, as seen by an electroencephalograph or EEG machine, maybe he would be able to turn them on and off at will. He added a relay circuit to an EEG machine to turn a tone on whenever alpha rhythm was present in the occipital cortex, the visual cortex at the back of the head, and found that college students rapidly learned to control the tone. This led Joe to begin studying the states of consciousness associated with different kinds of brain waves. Eventually, he studied brainwave patterns in Zen meditators and proposed that it might be possible to develop a psychophysiological of consciousness. Physiology of Consciousness. Kamaya, 1962-1968. Barbara Brown's brainwave research in the early 1960s also focused on the kinds of awareness associated with different brainwave patterns in 1970-1974. One of her most interesting studies on occipital brainwave patterns and psychological states involved the use of colored lights that were turned on and off by specific EEG frequencies. The subject's task was to discover for himself the subjective states that would operate the lights. By the end of the decade, many psychologists were studying states of consciousness and brainwave patterns. Before discussing brainwave training, it is useful to mention some basic facts about brain rhythms. Brainwave patterns have no sensory concomitants. That is, there are no sensory processes by means of which we can detect the presence of brainwave activity. We can detect tense muscles, cold hands, or a pounding heart. There is no way to sense brainwave activity. What we sense and control is not the brain wave itself, but a state of consciousness, a concatenation of subtle existential cues. In actuality, that is the way we control all normally unconscious processes. For instance, even though we can usually tell the difference between hot and cold hands, the way we learn to warm our hands or any part of our bodies through imagining a feeling of warmth permeating the part of the body in which blood flow is to be increased. Learning to control brainwave patterns or blood flow in a specific body regions or specific organs such as liver or pancreas does not depend on normal sensory feedback, but on the development of awareness of subtle internal sensations that normally do not notice until a feedback device tells us what is happening. Through the use of this increased awareness, we train our bodies to function more optimally. That is why we often refer to biofeedback training as awareness training. A major part of brainwave research has been concerned with the voltages in the occipital part of the head, at the very back of the skull. The brain surface that lies just beneath the occipital area of the skull is of particular interest because it is the visual projection area of the brain, the cortical area to which are projected all the visual signals that come from the rods and cones of the eyes. This very complex pattern of neural impulses is our view of the outside world. As mentioned before, no one has ever seen the outside world. That all that we can be aware of are our interpretations of the electrical pattern of the brain. Our only view of the world is our own living internal television screen. The occipital cortex is essentially the screen, and the eyes are two cameras that give us information about the frequencies and intensities of light. When the eyes are open, we say we are looking at the world, but it is the occipital cortex that we are actually look at. What we see are millions of brain cells firing in appropriate ways to display the retinal activity. Everything we have previously seen has an effect on what we previously see. I may say, I see a chair, but what I actually see is the retinal picture apparently mixed with my previous images of chairs. Perception is not exactly inaccurate, as most people believe, but is different for each person, in part because of the contribution of different past experiences. Figure 3 shows 4 major types of brainwave patterns: beta, alpha, theta, and delta. The lowest frequencies in the delta band are longest and slowest. They range from about 0.5 hertz cycles per second and 4 hertz. When people produce delta in any significant amount, they are generally found to be asleep or otherwise unconscious. The next higher band of frequencies from 4 to 8 hertz makes up theta. Theta rhythms are usually associated with near unconsciousness or subliminally conscious states. They often appear as a person becomes drowsy. The presence of theta is often accompanied by high hypnagogic or dreamlike images. The hypnagogic image, from Greek hypnos, sleep, plus agogos, leading, is one that comes into consciousness. A person is falling asleep. It was well described by Frederick Myers in about 1898. It is not a daydream type experience, but a projection of impulses from unconscious sources. Unlike in a daydream, the content is not consciously followed, but seems to appear suddenly out of nowhere, and therefore is often surprising or startling. Myers gave another name, hypnopompic images, to the kind that comes to mind just as one is waking up from sleep. Increasingly, however, the term hypnagogic is used to designate both types. Alpha rhythms from 8 to 13 hertz are associated with a more aware state than theta. Thus, although most untrained people are not able to maintain full consciousness during theta production, virtually everyone maintains awareness during alpha. Occipital alpha generally appears when a person closes his eyes. It is estimated that 90% of the human population produce brief bursts of alpha hundreds of times each day when they close their eyes for a second or two, and also when Their attention is focused on some interior image or daydream, even if their eyes are open. If you notice someone's eyes become glazed while you are speaking, you can assume that person has slipped into alpha and no longer hears what you are saying, though he may still hear the sound of your voice. During eyes open alpha, a person is generally not paying attention to what the eyes are pointed at, so to speak. In Figure 3, EEG patterns, these were obtained from a strip chart record of a theta feedback research subject at approximately the times indicated at the right. Start of the training session. When a person is active with eyes open, the EEG record from a scalp electrode at the back of the head generally shows the presence of beta waves, 13 to 26 cycles per second, or higher, as shown in record A above. 2 minutes later, when the eyes are closed and the body is relaxed, alpha waves at 8 to 13 cycles per second often begin to appear. When alpha first appears, it is sometimes a bit ragged from mixture with beta, CB. 10 minutes. As time passes, alpha often becomes smooth and regular in frequency, though the fluctuating amplitude, as in C, when the body is deeply relaxed and a person becomes drowsy. Theta waves at 4 to 8 cycles per second are often seen. 15 minutes. In meditators, a smooth theta pattern, rather than ragged, as in D, is often associated with the quiet body, quiet emotions, and quiet mind, but consciousness does not diminish. 20 minutes. At this stage, which is hinted at in E, one could begin to become conscious of the unconscious. If the subject goes to sleep, irregular delta waves at 1 to 4 cycles per second begin to be seen, as indicated in F. By contrast, beta 13 to 26 hertz and higher is usually associated with active attention, often focused on the outer world, but including thinking concretely. For example, when reading a book or watching a football game, occipital brainwave activity usually contains dominance of beta frequencies. It is also possible to find beta almost continuously in the occipital brainwave record when the eyes are closed. Such is the case if a person is anxious, thinking intensely, or trying to solve a specific pattern problem. For example, if you ask someone mentally to subtract from 393 by 17s, you are not likely to find alpha in the occipital brainwave record. One researcher noticed that people who are asked to find the square root of a number in their heads generally produced alpha, subtraction produced beta. The difference could be due to the fact that most people know how to subtract and can be activated in that task, but generally cannot remember how to find square roots, presumably as they try to go back in memory to their school days, searching for instructions long unused. The cortex, which is called the analyzer by Russian researchers, was relatively inactive, although allowing alpha to appear. A mathematician might produce brain beta when given the square root task, because he would not have to search his memory to do it. About 10% of the normal population produce very little occipital brain alpha when awake, even with eyes closed. Instead, they produce beta almost continuously. As mentioned before, this could be reflective of anxiety, but it also possible to keep the visual cortex activated by ceaseless thinking and imagining, especially if the imagery is attentively watched or examined. Related to this may be the fact that from hundreds of EEGs from schizophrenic patients, at least one clear finding has emerged. Such individuals often produce very little alpha, from which researchers deduce the presence of a constantly restless inner world. Occipital brainwave research might be quickly summarized as follows. When consciousness is alert and focused, beta is found. When consciousness is alert but unfocused, alpha is found. When a person becomes drowsy or moves into a state of consciousness, which Alice and Dale Walters and I call reverie, theta waves tend to appear. In deep sleep, delta waves appear. Another kind of sleep often associated with dreaming called REM, or rapid eye movement, or paradoxical sleep, shows a brainwave pattern that looks like the awake brain, although the person is asleep by all behavioral signs. Within this framework of the four major types of occipital brain rhythms and their accompanying states of consciousness, let us review some very interesting research findings that were reported in the early 1960s in Japan and India. These studies asked, what is the brainwave activity of a person who is meditating? Kasamatsu and Hirari 1963 studied the brainwave activity of Japanese Zen monks, a few of whom were regarded by their fellow monks as masters of Zazen, the Zen Buddhist way of meditation. They found that as a subject began to turn his attention inward, long trains of alpha rhythms appeared. B, as time passed, the dominant frequency of the alpha patterns began to decrease toward the alpha theta borders region, 8 hertz, and C, some subjects, those considered most accomplished at reaching a state of deep meditation, produced long trains of theta waves. When in the state of meditative consciousness, Zen masters are said to be in the state of knowing rather than thinking. Does this have implications for a left-right theory of consciousness in which left hemisphere thinks and right hemisphere knows? We will discuss this later. In Indian, Anand, China, and Singh, 1961, studied people practicing a yoga way of meditating. They observed that the meditative state could be easily intensely focused or closely controlled so that it could not be disrupted with flashing lights, sounding gongs, vibrations, or the touch of hot grass test tube. In other words, the state of inner concentration was profoundly detached from sensory stimulation. These researchers also noted that during such deep meditation periods, theta waves were appearing in the occipital brain records. Such reports suggested to us that being in a theta state might have special significance, provided, of course, that the person producing theta remains conscious while doing so. In many types of meditation, consciousness is supposed to be focused on the inner terrain, not on the outside world. We were very much interested, therefore, in studying brainwave patterns of ourselves and others who visited our laboratory and looking more closely at theta states. Reverie and creativity. I myself have been using a kind of meditative reverie to solve problems for a number of years. First as a student studying physics at UCLA, and later when I got stuck on a problem at University of Chicago. What was my brainwave pattern? When Dale Walters and Alice wired me to some psychophysiological recording equipment, we discovered that whenever I slipped into a state in which hypnagogic images appeared, they were accompanied by theta in the polygraph record and by an immediate, almost total relaxation in the blood vessels of the hand. In other words, in my case, deep relaxation was associated with the presence of theta and with the presence of hypnagogic imagery. As already mentioned, Alice was preparing a monograph on creativity and had done a great deal of reading on the subject. She found that many artists and scientists who have been unusually creative in their fields have written about their experiences. Many described a kind of reverie or near dream state in which intuitive ideas and solutions, in contradistinction to logical problem-solving solutions, come to consciousness in the form of hypnagogic images. Was it possible, we wondered, that they had been in a theta reverie when their creative ideas came to awareness? Considering what we knew, Alice and I began thinking about the possibility of developing psychophysiological training for creativity. Deep relaxation plus theta feedback seemed a good place to begin. No matter how startling the notion might at first sound, there is reason to believe that a person can learn to be creative. Creativity does not have to be something you are born with. Either you have it or do not have it, but might be something that you can learn through Theta training to control your focus of intention in a particular way. Perhaps everyone isn't innately creative and merely needs training in order to increase the objective evidence of it. It is worth mentioning again that brain waves are not known to have any sensory representation whatsoever. What can be detected and manipulated are such factors as focus of attention, thought processes, and feelings. The research program we developed in our laboratory is one of thought, emotion, and attention and control. In our work, brainwave control and voluntary changes in hand temperature, muscle tension are thought of primarily as physiological concomitants of psychological processes. Indesirable, we believe, to remain aware of the primacy of the psychological state in discussing this type of research, even though it is convenient to use shortcut phrases such as alpha training, temperature training, and EMG training. It might be objective that temperature and muscle tension training both involve sensory information that we normally get through the neural system itself. That may be true, but what we learn to control are certain existential states, not temperature, blood flow, or muscle tension per se. It is the central nervous system that is trained, rather than blood vessels or muscles. Before we discuss our brainwave training projects, it is interesting as well as useful to examine some of the existential reports of people who have used imagery creatively. William Blake, John Milton, and Samuel Coleridge are classic examples of artists and poets who received inspiration through imagery while in unusual states of consciousness. Many people have described the states of reverie, dream, or near dream in which creative solutions and inspirations came to consciousness. For example, John Cocteau in 1952 wrote to his friend Jacques Maritain, "The poet is at disposal of his night. He must clean his house and await its visitation." He explained, "The play that I am producing is a visitation of this sort. One morning, after I have slept poorly, I woke with a start and witnessed, as from a seat in a theater, three acts which brought to life an epic and characters about which had no documentary information." This experience led to his play, The Knights of the Round Table. Robert Louis Stevenson's ability to command the brownies of his mind to furnish him with a story while he slept is well known. Well known, too, is Poincare's description of a vision he beheld as lay in bed asleep, mathematical ideas rising in clouds, dancing before him, and colliding and combining into what he recognized as the first set of fusion functions, the solution to a problem he had been struggling to solve for some time. Ellie Walkup, 1965, studied creative scientists in his paper Creativity in Science Through Visualization. He says, "Creative persons appear to have stumbled onto and then developed to a high degree of perfection the ability to visualize, almost hallucinate, in the area in which they are creative. And their visualization seems to be of a sort that lend themselves to easily manipulation in the thinking process. This is illustrated by reports by many of the great inventors of the past, and it is easy to demonstrate that individuals differ enormously in the kind and degree of their ability to think in such manipulative visualizations. If correct, the aspect of creativity suggests many research attacks and many potential changes in education for create, creative activity." Three meditators. The brainwave activity of three subjects who were self-trained over a period of 15 to 30 years in internal scanning techniques, a kind of meditation, was recorded in our psychophysiology lab. Two of them demonstrated an unusually high percentage of theta waves in their EEG records during periods of deep reverie, occasionally producing long trains of theta waves. Both reported the presence of hypnagogic or dreamlike images, which they said were customary in their meditation experience. The third subject was able to reduce his normal alpha frequency from 9.5 hertz down to about 8.3 hertz, near the alpha theta border, during a series of trials. He reported this as a mind quieting, imaginaceless state, preliminary to a deeper state of consciousness. Hypnagogic imagery was not part of his normal experience, he said. States of consciousness and reaction time. Dale Walters designed what was essentially an experiment in sensory deprivation in which we studied reaction time and the states of consciousness. In this study, reports of hypnagogic imagery were frequently associated with drowsiness and the presence of theta waves. The images were called to conscious awareness by reaction time stimulus, the bump of the light wave button on the subject's finger. One subject, for example, reported that the stimulus caused him to become suddenly aware of little pictures in his mind he had not known were there. He described a void from which the pictures popped when the stimulus was given. Without the stimulus, he said, he would not have been able to remember what was in his mind. This was an almost classical description of the unusual way in which hypnagogic images appear, coming suddenly to mind from some unknown source. 2 Theta trainees. A number of people had contacted us to ask if they might come to Topeka and work with us in some kind of experimental growth training program. We liked the idea, and I took on the task of working out a program. Eventually, we put together the following elements in this exploratory project: assigning reading to yoga philosophy, discussion, yoga training consisting of postures, breathing exercises, concentration, traveling through the body, and meditation, autogenic feedback training, including temperature feedback, and most important, theta feedback. The 2 women whose theta experiences are recounted below were our guinea pigs. These excerpts are from their diaries. First, J.H., a woman in her mid-20s, who wrote as follows. The alpha theta patterns, which began with the alpha and went into theta, were not associated with images. My mind was fairly active, and during complete thoughtless periods, there was neither alpha nor theta. After several minutes of a lot of alpha and theta, I began to feel quite disassociated from the sound, as though there was all the activity and my brain was completely passive. With this feeling came the disassociation with my body, which got a little scary, though I did not move or open my eyes to come out of it. During this session, I also noticed that having sounds to passively attend to seemed to produce more. My mind was less likely to follow thought after thought when there were sounds to occupy it. From an entry 10 days later. There are so far 2 main differences between alpha state, lots of alpha and little theta, and the theta state, lots of theta and little alpha. In the alpha state, I am still making thoughts occur, but they have the feeling of being somewhat less attached. Images which occur in this state go along with the thoughts and were there in my mind by my conscious image making faculty. In the theta state, thoughts are quite detached. They feel as though they are flowing along, and there are vague images which also have this quality. And in retrospect, I am not sure if the images actually went with the thoughts. I don't have the feeling in theta that I put the images into my mind. Feeling of the perceptual change. In alpha, though my eyes are closed, I feel as though if my eyes were opened, I would be looking out through them. I feel this physically, and it feels as though my conscious were attached to things outside my eyes, things external to me. When I begin to go toward theta, it feels as though my focal point is changing from being in front of my eyes to behind my eyes. I feel this physically and have wondered if my eyes are turning in anyway. I have the feeling that perception is inside my head and does not extend past my eyes. Sometimes this occurs with a slight falling feeling. It's interesting that this usually comes when I'm about to fall asleep when I'm home in bed. JH's report indicates that she attempted to observe himself closely in training sessions. She had not yet realized that this is necessary to turn off the analyzing mind to observe, to be the witness, as it is often called in the literature of Asia. 6 days later, she described her first subjective experiences of what she felt to be a theta state. The processes were detached thoughts and a stream of very vague images running along simultaneously with the thoughts, but not connected with them. At least that is how it seemed at the time. These images were simply floating by. They were light with no color, and I think that they were objects, figures and faces, but they were not clear and had no outlines, and they were meaningless. Also, they went by against a dark background. The vagueness of these images is not merely faulty memory. I remember being aware at the time that they were very vague. As our sessions went on, it became evident that when she produced a great deal of theta, she was unaware not of the theta feedback, but also of her internal experience, in spite of the fact that she had the feeling that the stream of disassociated thoughts and images was constant. Although she felt she had not learned any control of theta, her diary 2 days later says, "This was a strange session. It does seem that I am learning to get into the theta region without first a long period of alpha. Subjectively, I feel more internal sooner, though perhaps this is because the beginnings of these last sessions have been relatively quiet and peaceful." A diary report from her last 4 days of theta practice indicates JH growing recognition that theta is still somehow escaping her. I attributed the amount of theta at the beginning of this session to be due to the fact that I was sitting up and didn't feel as inward as in the previous sessions. I was surprised during the session to hear so much alpha and theta, and I noted that I was continuously thinking in an active way, which previously in the early sessions would have stopped alpha. I found that I was able to carry out thoughts with no interruptions unless I really focused my mind and forcefully created thoughts, then alpha would stop. Although I was under the impression that I was thinking throughout the entire session with no lapses in consciousness, I must have been wrong. I simply can't believe that I produced so much alpha and theta. I wasn't aware of it at all, I'm sure. Also, the time seemed shorter than it actually was. The subject's failure so often to hear the theta tones, to have many minutes of almost constant theta with no awareness of that fact, and with little ability to draw up into consciousness awareness what was going on just below the normally conscious level, contributed to our decision to design some way of bringing subjects to awareness during or just after theta burst. In the 2 weeks immediately following the completion of her participation in the program, JH reported experiencing three very vivid, spontaneous, hypnagogic images when she was relaxing, something she had never experienced before. The second subject, AE, was a woman in her mid 30s. She was a professional writer, and her ability to express herself in writing makes the reports from her diary especially interesting. About 10 days after entering the program, she wrote, "The alpha theta meter presents me with an interesting problem, finding then staying on that thin edge between low frequency alpha consciousness and high frequency theta semi consciousness. It seems rather easy for me to produce plenty of alpha. This machine is a positive chirping bird if I leave the alpha signal activated. So some days ago, I decided to work only with the theta signal. The first experience of that was long, long silences with an occasional bleep of theta. One session, however, I was especially imageful, and there were perhaps a dozen theta signals. But I was not confident that the images I recall were indeed those associated with the theta burst, for there was an abundance of images outside the theta burst in what I expect would be low frequency alpha periods. 11 days earlier, 11 days later, her diary entry said, "There are three things worth noting. I shall do so briefly, for none of them were very strong or vivid. I would rather not try to flash them out with my waking consciousness. First, there was a relatively strong physical sensation of a warm pressure or weight that seemed somehow to come from inside my body, even though I can best describe it as a pressure on my body. I felt it on my arms and hands, especially, and perhaps elsewhere in my upper torso. It lasted, or I should say, I was conscious of it only a minute or so, but during that time, it was very real and marked. It occurred again several moments later, but not so strongly in the area of my knees and lower thighs. Aside from the awareness of the sensation itself, no thoughts or images occurred committedly. Second, twice I felt vaguely afraid, but so vague that I cannot say anything more about these faintest of stirrings. Finally, one image presented itself, a frightful one that I did not, however, truly frighten me. The distorted face of a man, wrinkled and lined by folds of flesh. His one eye was like a very old apple that had turned pale brown and shriveled. It stood out of his eye socket. I saw no other eye. The image lasted several seconds, it seemed, and I got a good look at his face. It was alive. The changeless grimace seemed alive somehow, and the head turned somewhat. As I say, I was aware that this was a hideous image. Yet I was not afraid of so much as curious to watch it, see what it might do. When A first began training with the alpha theta feedback meter, she was able to practice no longer than 30 to 40 minutes at a time. She became more comfortable in it. She extended the time to an hour and sometimes even longer. About 7 days after preceding entry, she asked me if she might try a session without feedback. Her report as follows. It was decided that I might try the theta feedback without auditory signal, as I thought I had enough experience with the feedback to be able to recognize the subjective quality of theta to some extent further. I was pretty sure that the signal interrupted the theta state and that without that tone, it might be possible to stay in the state longer and have a better chance to bring something back from it. Accordingly, that evening I worked without the tone. Not much happened, that is, there's no more theta than I usually have, and remember nothing concrete about the session. Here, I would like to make general comment and is still feeling the mood of mild depression. I think such a mood is antagonistic to internal awareness. Even though I consciously wanted to explore my theta material, some other part of I did not want to do, and the second I won out. Theta Pilot Group. We learned many things about training for hypnagogic imagery from exploratory observations. We felt confident, for instance, that in order to maximize its effectiveness in a training program ought to include autogenic phrases, breathing exercises, and alpha theta brainwave feedback. We had also discovered that we were going to need some sort of alerting device that would prevent a person from going too deep into theta and thereby into unawareness of any associated imagery. One way we knew of to maintain consciousness while reclining comfortably in a quiet, dimly lit room in a situation highly conducive to sleep was to keep the forearm and hand erect, balanced vertically on the elbow. If the state becomes too deep so that awareness slips away, the arm falls and brings the person back to consciousness. We liked the arm balancing idea and used it in constructing a sensitive alerting device. This was a finger ring with a built-in mercury switch that closed a circuit if tilted more than 20 degrees in any direction, setting off a door chime to bring the subject back to consciousness. While the ring was being constructed, we wrote a proposal requesting support of our theta work from the U.S. Office of Education, Department of Health, Education and Welfare. I wrote the specifications for portable brainwave trainers in this proposal. The machines would feed back different tones to indicate the presence of beta, alpha, and theta frequencies. It was our intention, though, to try these machines first with a special pilot group of 10 meditators. These portable brainwave trainers were scaled down models of the large laboratory brainwave analyzer he had built in 1969. The lab machine, much too complex for general use, can feed back information in 3 brainwave patterns simultaneously. This feature had proved very useful, and we wanted the ability in the portable machines. The lab machine also had the interesting characteristic of being able to feed back stereo information. Brainwave data from 2 electrodes, left occiput and right occiput, for instance, can be separately fed back into the left ear and right ear through earphones. In addition, actual frequencies in the EEG signal are analyzed into beta, 13 to 25 hertz, alpha, 8 to 13 hertz, and theta, 4 to 8 hertz, and multiplied in each frequency band by 200 in order to bring the brain frequency up to the audible range. For example, because the lower limit of hearing is around 25 hertz, the average alpha frequency, 10 hertz, would be inaudible without amplification. Multiply by 200 and the average alpha feedback tone goes to 2000, which lies in the range of the human hearing spectrum. Each wave in a series of alpha waves is of slightly different duration. Thus, even though 10 hertz is the average frequency, what is actually observed in a train of alpha waves, wave by wave, is more like 10 hertz, 9.5, 10.1, 10.7, 9.0, 9.2, 11.2, 10.8, 9.1, etc. When multiplied by 200, these alpha waves generate a series of musical tones that sound quite like flute music. The volume of the music depends on the amplitude height of the individual waves.